The station's third-shift market smelled the way everything on Kelvar 9 smelled after midnight. Fried protein blocks, recycled air that tasted faintly of copper, and the particular brand of loneliness that comes from being too far from any planet worth naming. Marcus Webb had been running his supply counter for 6 years, and he knew every smell the place could make. He knew which ventilation duct wheezed before it cycled. He knew which overhead light flickered every 43 minutes like a nervous tick. He knew when something was different. Tonight something was different. He'd been restocking the dried grain shelves when he caught the movement in his peripheral vision. Low, fast, and wrong. Not wrong like a threat. Wrong like something small and frightened, trying very hard not to exist. He didn't move. He'd learned that lesson with stray dogs when he was 7 years old on a farm in Manitoba. You move fast toward something that's scared, you don't get a second chance. He just kept placing grain packets on the shelf, slow and deliberate, and watched the gap between the bottom shelf and the floor where the shadow had gone still. A hand appeared first. 4 fingers, but wrong, too long in proportion. The knuckles doubled, the skin a pale silver gray that caught the fluorescent light and gave back a faint blue shimmer. The fingers were shaking. They closed around a protein bar that had fallen off the edge of the bottom shelf. And then, so carefully, so slowly, like the movement itself was something that could shatter, they pulled it back under. Marcus set the grain packet down. He crouched slowly and looked under the shelf. She was maybe 3 feet tall, curled as small as she could make herself, which wasn't very small because she was all limbs, the same long doubled knuckles on her hands, the same proportions in her legs, folded up like a carpenter's rule. Her ears came to soft points high on her head. Her eyes were enormous, the irises a color that didn't have a name in any human language he knew, somewhere between amber and the light that comes through old glass. Those eyes were locked on him. She had the protein bar pressed to her chest with both hands. She did not run. He understood after a second why she'd been waiting for him to notice, and the waiting had cost her everything she had. There was nothing left in her for running. She was just staring at him with those impossible eyes, every muscle in her small body locked rigid with fear, and he recognized that kind of stillness. He'd seen it in emergency rooms, in animals caught in wire, in people who'd run as far as they could and understood that running was done. He sat down on the floor, cross-legged, the way he used to sit when his daughter was little, and he wanted to get to her eye level without making her feel cornered. "Hey," he said quietly, "you're okay." She flinched at his voice but didn't bolt. He pointed at the protein bar she was holding. "That one's actually the worst flavor we carry. Synthetic chicken. It tastes like regret." He kept his voice easy, conversational, the way you talk to someone across a very wide distance. "If you're hungry, I've got better." Her grip on the bar tightened. "Okay," he said, "keep that one, I'm not going to take it." He stood back up slowly, went behind the counter, and started making the thing he'd been planning for his own dinner, a pressed sandwich of actual grain bread, real protein from the station's hydro farm, and a sauce that his sister had taught him to make from whatever spices survived the freight run. He wrapped it in parchment the way she'd taught him. He set it on the floor at the end of the counter, in the open space between the shelves, and then walked back to the far end of the counter and turned around so his back was to it. He restocked grain for 3 minutes. He heard very small footsteps. He heard the crinkle of parchment. He didn't turn around. When he did turn around, after another full minute of deliberate shelf restocking, the sandwich was gone and she was back under the bottom shelf. But this time, she wasn't hiding all the way back. She was at the edge. She had her long fingers curled around the shelf strut, and she was watching him with those amber glass eyes, and she was eating. "Good?" he asked. She watched him. "The sauce is her recipe," he said, meaning his sister, not expecting the girl to know what he meant. "She made me write it down before I left, said I'd thank her eventually. She was right." The girl's jaw worked, she swallowed. And then she said something. It wasn't any language he had an implant for, the standard galactic trade package he'd paid for before taking the station contract didn't cover whatever she was speaking. It was full of consonants that clicked, and a particular falling pitch on the last syllable that sounded, if he was being honest, a little like an apology. "I didn't catch that," he said, "but you're welcome anyway." She said something else, and then she did something he didn't expect. She pushed the remaining protein bar, the bad synthetic chicken one she'd stolen, out from under the shelf and across the floor toward him. An offering, a payment, restitution. He looked at the protein bar. He looked at her. "You keep it," he said. "You might get hungry again later." She pulled it back. He went back to work. She stayed under the shelf. It wasn't comfortable or normal, but it was, somehow, okay. The particular kind of okay that exists in the space between two creatures who have agreed without words to stop being afraid of each other, at least for now. He was halfway through the next row of shelves when she came out from under entirely. She stood in the middle of the aisle at her full 3 feet, clutching both the stolen protein bar and the parchment from the sandwich in her 2 long hands, and she looked at him with a kind of desperate urgency that had nothing to do with hunger. She said something, pointed at the parchment, at the food, and then pointed toward the floor, toward down, the lower levels. He understood the gesture. He understood the urgency. He didn't understand the words, but he didn't need to. "Someone else," he said. "There's someone else." She said something that clicked and fell at the end and pointed again. Down. "Someone who needs food." She shook her head, not a no exactly, but more. She pressed one long hand to her own side, and he watched her small face change. The urgency in it went sideways into something rower, something a kid that age shouldn't have to carry. "Hurt," he said. "Someone's hurt." She held his gaze. Marcus Webb had been a supply clerk, a diner cook, a freight runner, and for 8 months in his mid-30s, a volunteer first responder in the rural district back home. He looked at this small alien girl with her borrowed parchment and her stolen protein bar, and the look on her face that he knew from every emergency room he'd ever worked in, the look of someone who has been holding a thing together by themselves for just a little too long, and he made a decision. He went to the back room and got his kit. It wasn't a real medical kit. That was at the station clinic 2 levels up, but he kept supplies for the kind of minor emergencies a 6-year posting in the middle of nowhere generated. Wound sealant, a basic diagnostic wand from the supply manifest, painkillers that worked across most carbon-based biologies, clean dressings, water packets, the emergency ration blocks that didn't taste like anything but kept a body going. He put it all in a carry bag. He added more of the real food, 2 more sandwiches, quickly assembled, a pouch of the hydro broth that he kept for cold nights, a handful of the grain packs. The girl watched him load the bag. Her expression shifted, not into trust exactly, but into something adjacent to it, a tentative willingness to believe. He slung the bag over his shoulder. He looked at her. "Lead the way," he said, and gestured toward the door. She stared at him for a long moment with those amber-glass eyes, assessing something he couldn't name, running some internal calculation he had no framework to read. Then she turned and walked to the door, glanced back once to make sure he was coming, and slipped through it into the corridor. He followed her into the station's dark. Kelvar 9 was, as stations went, not particularly well designed. It had grown in layers the way frontier posts always did. The original core, then the expansion ring, then the expansion of the expansion ring, then the merchant quarter that got bolted on when the shipping lane shifted, and below all of it, the access levels that nobody official ever went to because the lighting was wrong and the floor plates weren't rated for heavy equipment. It was a station that had been added to faster than it had been planned, and the result was the kind of architectural patchwork that made it an excellent place to hide. She knew the route. That was the first thing that settled into Marcus's awareness as he followed her through the lower corridors. She didn't hesitate. There was no circling, no doubling back to find the right turn. She moved through these tunnels with the unhurried confidence of someone who had been mapping this place for days, taking paths that bypassed the security checkpoints, ducking through maintenance hatches that he had to fold himself nearly in half to get through. She also checked behind them, regularly. Every 3 or 4 minutes she'd stop and look back, not at him but past him at the corridor they'd come through. It was a thing he recognized from his first responder days, the checking. The people who did it weren't paranoid. They were people who had a real reason to be watched. "Someone's following you," he said quietly, on the third time she stopped to look. She turned to him. He didn't know if she'd understood the words, but she'd understood the tone, the flat, factual one that means, "I see it too." She held his gaze for a moment and then turned and kept moving. Faster. The access level at the bottom of Kelvar 9 was cold. The heating systems didn't reach down here with any conviction, and the air had a damp quality, a faint smell of old coolant and rust, that reminded Marcus of the basement of his grandmother's house in a way that didn't quite make sense given that everything around him was metal and alien. She led him through a section where the floor plating had been partially removed for maintenance that was clearly never completed, across a makeshift bridge of salvaged panels, and then around 2 turns that brought them to a section of the wall that looked, at first glance, identical to every other section of the wall. She pressed her palm to a spot low on the wall panel and pushed. It swung inward, a removed section, concealed, balanced carefully so it moved without scraping. Beyond it was a space that wasn't on any station schematic Marcus had ever seen, a gap between 2 structural supports, maybe 8 feet deep and 12 feet across, accessed through the hidden panel, invisible from any corridor. She had turned it into a shelter. There was salvaged insulation on the floor for warmth. There was a gathered collection of light sticks, the cheap chemical kind that lasted about 30 hours, lined up along one wall to give illumination. There was a cache of supplies, more stolen protein bars, a few water packets, a piece of thermal emergency blanket. And there on the insulation, wrapped in the rest of the thermal blanket, was the alien woman. She was tall, Marcus could tell even lying down, and clearly the same species as the girl. The same silver-gray skin, the same pointed ears, the same long fingers. Her eyes were closed. Her face was a careful mask, the kind of still that isn't peace, it's concentration. She was focusing on something internal, and he recognized that too, managing pain. You went somewhere inside yourself, and you stayed there because the alternative was worse. Her side, her right side where her arm was folded over it. He could see, even through the thermal blanket, the way she held that side carefully, the particular stillness of someone guarding an injury. The girl slipped past him and knelt beside the woman, touching her face gently. The woman's eyes opened. They landed on Marcus immediately, sharp, assessing, despite everything. He didn't move. He kept his hands visible and his posture open, and he looked her in the face, not at the injury, because the first thing you give an injured person is dignity. She said something. Her voice was controlled but thin, the thinness of someone running on the last of their reserves. She was looking at him with the same amber glass eyes as the girl, and they held the same falling question at the end. The girl answered her, a quick explanation, the words clicking and falling in the dark. The woman's eyes moved back to Marcus. He couldn't read alien expressions, he knew that, knew the arrogance of assuming he could, but something in the woman's face changed. It was subtle. The mask didn't drop, but something at the edges of it loosened, just slightly, the way a person's face changes when they go from bracing for one thing and receive another. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. "Either of you. I know you probably can't understand me, but that's what I'm saying." He set the bag down on the floor between them and crouched beside it. He took out the broth first. She needed fluid more than food, and the diagnostic wand would tell him more once he got a reading, and he offered it to the woman, holding the pouch out where she could take it herself. She looked at it, she looked at him. He set it down within her reach and sat back. She reached for it. While she drank slowly, because her body was telling her to, Marcus opened the diagnostic wand and ran the initial scan. The wand's readout was designed for the 12 most common galactic biologies. She wasn't on the list, but the wand could estimate from base indicators, and what it gave him was enough. Wound to the right side. Sealed on the surface, someone had done basic field dressing, but the internal reading was wrong. Pressure building. She needed a real medic, not a supply clerk with a diagnostic wand and a first responder certificate from 8 years ago. He looked at her face. She was watching him read the wand's output with those controlled eyes, and he understood all at once that she knew. She knew exactly how bad it was. She'd known for however long they'd been down here, days maybe, and she'd been managing it and directing the girl to find food and waiting for something. A ship, a contact, something. "How long?" he said, holding up the wand and pointing at it, then at her side. He held up fingers 1, 2, 3 and made it a question with his face. She looked at his fingers. She held up 3 of her own and then made a gesture that he read as approximately 3 days, roughly. 3 days in the cold, in a hidden space, with an internal injury, managing it alone while her daughter stole protein bars. He put the wand down and opened the kit properly. The wound sealant wouldn't fix the internal pressure, but it could stabilize it. The painkillers, he checked the multi-biology indicator on the label. She was close enough to the profile that they'd work at a reduced dose, would give her some relief. The clean dressings, the ration blocks, all of it wasn't a solution. It was a bridge, something to keep her stable long enough to get her to someone who could actually help. He worked carefully. She let him, not easily, not without cost, but she held still and kept her breathing controlled and watched his hands with those sharp eyes. Once, when he had to apply pressure to check the seal, she made a sound that she cut off almost immediately, and the girl, sitting on the other side of her, reached over and held her hand without being asked. The woman closed her long fingers around the girl's. Marcus kept his eyes on the work. "She's been doing a good job," he said, not expecting a response, just talking the way he always talked to patients when the talking was the only comfort he had to give. "Getting food, finding this place. She's been smart and she's been careful and she's been brave." He glanced up at the girl briefly. "She found me because she was paying attention and she thought I looked safe. Good judgment." He looked back at the work. "Better than a lot of adults I know." He finished the dressing and sat back. The woman had her eyes closed again, managing. The painkillers would take 20 minutes to reach effective levels. He made the sandwiches, both of them, one for the girl, one for the woman when she felt up to it. He set the woman's aside and handed the girl hers, and she ate it the same way she'd eaten the first one. Carefully, the way someone eats when they've been rationing and some part of their nervous system hasn't gotten the message yet that there's enough. The light sticks kept their patient glow. The cold kept its patient pressure. Marcus sat with his back against the structural support and let the silence do what silence does when it's been earned. The woman's name, the closest he could approximate it, was something that started with a sound he didn't have a letter for and ended with a long syllable that fell. The girl's name was closer to manageable, something like Sira, with the same falling final note. He gave them his name slowly, pointing at himself. Marcus. The woman tried it and it came out slightly different, the consonants reshaped to fit her language's phonology. The girl tried it and got surprisingly close. It became, in the hours that followed, a particular kind of conversation. Gestures and faces, and the slow building of a shared vocabulary made from pointing and demonstration, and the international language of someone drawing on the floor with a finger when nothing else works. He learned that they had been on Kelvar 9 for 4 days. He was fairly sure he learned that they'd arrived on a ship that was gone now. He learned, from the way the woman's face changed when she mimed the ship leaving, that it hadn't left willingly. Someone had taken it, or forced it out, or the woman had sent it away for reasons she communicated with a gesture he couldn't fully parse, something about safety, something about others. He didn't push. She was stabilizing, and that mattered more than his questions. What he did understand was the checking, Sierra's regular scanning of the corridors when they'd been walking, the way the woman's eyes went to the panel every time the station made a noise. Someone was looking for them. Not station security, or not just station security. Something the woman was more afraid of than the injury. Around what his internal clock told him was 3 in the morning, station time, he said. I need to go get a real medic. The woman's eyes opened immediately. She needs more than I can do, he said. He tried to show it with the diagnostic wand, held it out, showed the readout, pointed at the numbers that were in the yellow range. Not red yet. Yellow, but yellow turned to red if you waited long enough. The woman looked at the wand. She looked at him. She said something, and this time the tone was clear even through the language barrier, a question that was also an assessment. Could she trust him to come back? He looked at her steadily. I'll come back, he said, with help. That's all. Long pause. She said something to Sierra. The girl answered. Another exchange brief, and he caught something in it that felt like the woman asking whether he'd been kind and Sierra saying yes, more than kind. He couldn't have said why he was sure of that. He just was. The woman said something directly to him. The tone of it was different from anything she'd said before. It wasn't a question. It was a thing being given. He nodded slowly. He didn't know what she'd said, but he understood the weight of it. He left the carry bag. He left the food and the medical supplies and the light sticks he'd brought in his jacket pocket. He told Sierra, as clearly as he could through mime and careful speaking, stay here, I'll come back. She watched him go with those amber eyes and didn't look afraid, exactly. She looked like someone who had decided to believe in something and was now waiting to find out if they'd been right. He climbed back up through the dark and cold of Kelvar 9 lower levels and found the one person on the station he trusted without condition. Dr. Yale Osai, who ran the station's medical bay with a particular combination of competence and stubbornness that Marcus had long since recognized as the only 2 qualities that survived a long posting in the middle of nowhere. He found her in her office, not sleeping because Yale rarely slept on a schedule, going over supply invoices with a look of profound disapproval. She looked up at him when he came in. She read his face. How bad, she said. Internal pressure, 3 days at least. The wand put her in yellow, but it's trending. Carbon-based? I think so, close enough that the standard painkillers worked. Age? The patient's adult. There's also a child. He paused. They're hiding, Yale. Someone's looking for them. We need to be quiet about this. Yale put down the invoice. She looked at him with the expression she had for situations that other people would call complicated, and she called interesting. Where? Sub-level 4, I'll take you. She gathered her kit, the real kit, not the supply clerk version, and followed him back into the dark. Yale assessed the situation in the way she always did, quickly and without comment until she was finished. She spoke in the soft, low register she used with patients who were frightened, which worked across language barriers because volume and tone were universal. She worked methodically, explained each step to Marcus so he could explain it to Yale. He couldn't translate the words, but he could translate the action, showing the woman what Yale was about to do before she did it. It was clumsy and slow, and it worked. The internal pressure was manageable. Not a rupture close, but not there. Yale had a portable compression device that could handle it externally while the underlying tissue healed, which would take approximately a week, and a diet that didn't consist of stolen protein bars. She can't stay down here, Yale said while she worked. I know. And she clearly can't go to the main medical bay. I know that too. Yale glanced at him sideways. You have a plan, or are you just saying I know to things? I'm getting to the plan, Marcus said. The plan, such as it was the back room of his supply depot, which was large enough for 2 people, and had a lock on the door that he controlled and wasn't on any station diagram as residential space. It wasn't comfortable and it wasn't protocol, but it was warm and private and it was his, which meant nobody came in without his permission. The woman, he'd started thinking of her as Lyra, a shortening of the closest approximation of her name he could manage. Listen to Yale explain this through Marcus's mime, and a few diagrams Yale drew on a piece of kit packaging. She looked at the diagram, she looked at Yale, she looked at Marcus. She said something that included his name, his approximated name, and then something that made Sierra, listening, look at him with those amber eyes and say something small and certain. "What did she say?" Yale asked. "I don't know," Marcus said, "but I think it was okay." Moving Lyra through the station's lower levels was the most complicated thing Marcus had done in 6 years on Kelvar 9. It had to be done in the small hours when the corridors were emptiest. Yale managed the compression device, Marcus managed the route, and Sierra, without being asked, managed the checking. Every junction, she stopped and looked. Her instincts for when to move and when to wait were better than his. He started watching her face instead of the corridors, using her stillness and her movement as his signal. They made it to the supply depot without meeting anyone who mattered. He installed them in the back room. Yale set up what she could. Sierra found a corner and sat in it with her knees to her chest and the protein bar, still the same original stolen one, in her hands, and watched everyone with those steady amber eyes. When Yale left, with strict instructions for Marcus, and a look she gave him that said, "You're going to tell me the rest of this story at some point," the supply depot went quiet. Marcus pulled up a stool near the back room door, not inside, respecting the boundary, and did the thing he'd always done in the long hours of an emergency. He stayed, and he was present, and he let the being there do whatever work being there could do. After a while, Lyra said something from inside the room. He leaned toward the open door. "I'm sorry, I still don't." She said it again, and this time Sierra from her corner spoke over her mother. A different cadence, careful. And then she did something that surprised him. She touched the side of her own neck, where the universal translator node sat on most registered travelers, and made a gesture he understood immediately. They had won or had had won, or. Sierra pointed at her mother, then made a breaking gesture, cracked. The translator was broken. "On her," he said. Sierra nodded. He looked at her carefully. Do you have one?" She shook her head. He thought about this. Then he said, "If I can find you one, could you," he pointed at the node location on his own neck, "use it, even just for enough to." Sierra looked at her mother. Her mother said something, a brief exchange. Then Sierra nodded. The station's equipment shop opened at 6. Marcus waited, ran the depot's opening through third shift, and at 6:03 he was at the equipment shop's counter explaining to a bleary technician that he needed a basic translation node replacement for a non-standard species profile, the kind used by unregistered travelers, and he needed it without running the ID check because his regular customer's documentation was in processing. He paid the price the technician named without negotiating, which was too high, but was the cost of the technician not asking further questions. He brought it back to the depot. Sierra picked it up. She turned it in her long fingers and then looked at her mother, and her mother said something quiet and very specific, and Sierra pressed the node to the spot below her left ear and held it there for the pairing sequence. The node blinked twice, completed. Sierra said, "Hello." Her voice, in galactic trade, was a small, precise thing, accented at the edges but clear. She said it the way someone says a word they've been waiting to say for a long time. "Hello," Marcus said. She said, "My name is Sierra." "I know, I'm Marcus." "I know," she said. "I heard them say it." She glanced at the back room. Her voice changed slightly. "My mother wants to speak with you." He moved the stool to the doorway. Lyra was propped against the wall, the compression device doing its quiet work. She looked marginally better than the previous night, not well, but present, alert. The mask of pain management loosened slightly into something closer to simply her face. She spoke, and the node processed it with a half-second delay. "You helped us without knowing who we were," she said, "without any reason." "You needed help," Marcus said. "There are many people on this station. None of them helped." A pause. "I watched. For 2 days I watched. I sent Sira out to see who was safe." Another pause, and something moved in her expression, the same thing he'd seen in Sira's face when she'd been under the shelf. "She watched you for half a day before she tried to take the food." He thought about that. His daughter would have been 12 this year. The particular ache of that was familiar now, lived in. He didn't let it land in his face. "She was careful," he said, "and smart. You should be proud of her." Lyra looked at Sira, and the look was the whole complicated weight of a parent watching their child have been afraid and brave at the same time. "She is my greatest pride," Lyra said, in the flat tone of the translator that somehow failed to flatten what was underneath it. He let that sit. "The people who are looking for you," he said carefully. "Can you tell me anything about them, so I can watch?" Lyra was quiet for a moment. "You would be safer not knowing." "I'm already in it," Marcus said. "Easier to navigate if I can see." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said something to Sira in their own language, outside the node's processing, and Sira answered with a single word that sounded, to his ear, like something being settled. Lyra said, "We carry letters, documents, proof of something that certain people would prefer remain unproven. We were on our way to the council tribunal when our escort ship was disabled. The people who disabled it are looking for what we carry." She paused. "And for us because we are the proof." "Witnesses," Marcus said. "Yes." He sat back. He looked at the floor for a moment, thinking. Then he said, "How long until someone from your side can reach you here, if you sent a message?" "If the right people receive it, 3 days, perhaps 4. If the message is intercepted," she stopped. "I have a private comms terminal," Marcus said. "Supply depot equipment, not on the station's main network, freight channel encryption." He looked up at her. "If you can write out the message, I can send it." Lyra stared at him. The stare was not suspicious. It was past suspicious, past the point where suspicion had any more work to do. It was something else. A kind of stillness that held a question she was deciding whether to ask. "Why?" she said. He thought about it honestly. "Because she picked me," he said. "Because Sira watched half the station and picked me, and I don't want her to have been wrong." Lyra closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, something had changed. "Give me something to write on," she said. He spent the rest of that night in the supply depot's back room doorway. Not sleeping, with his back against the frame and the station sounds doing what they always did. The wheeze of the ventilation duct at its scheduled interval, the distant clank of freight drones running the overnight cycle, the occasional voice from the corridor outside when a third-shift worker cut through. He'd spent a lot of nights like this in different configurations over the years, keeping watch for reasons that changed, but the watching itself remained. In Manitoba, in his 20s, when his daughter was sick and his wife was asleep, and he was the one who stayed awake to listen for changes in her breathing. During the 8 months of first responder work, waiting in the truck for the call. On Kelvar 9, in the early years, when the frontier nature of the station meant that things happened in the night that required someone to be awake and paying attention. Sira slept. She'd pulled herself into the corner with the insulation blanket. He'd brought more down from the emergency supply rack, and she slept the way exhausted children sleep, completely and without reservation, her long limbs folded in, the bioluminescence on her forearms pulsing very slowly in the dark. He watched that slow pulse for a while. It had a rhythm like breathing, and he wasn't sure if it was connected to breathing or just to sleep. And the not knowing was interesting in the particular way things were interesting when you'd been sitting with them long enough. Lyra didn't sleep until near 4 in the morning. She lay with the compression device doing its work and kept her eyes open, and he understood, without needing it said, that she was listening for the same things he was. It took him a while to realize they'd fallen into a kind of alternating attention. When he was watching the door, she had her eyes closed and seemed to be managing. When he shifted, she opened them. It wasn't coordinated. It was just what two people do when they share a watch. At 4, she finally slept. He watched the door until 6 and then went to unlock the depot. The 3 days that followed were the most carefully normal days Marcus Webb had run in 6 years of a very normal posting. The supply depot opened and closed on schedule. He restocked and sold and smiled at the regulars and turned away solicitors at the counter with the particular practice patience he'd developed for the job. The back room was locked and stayed locked, and nobody asked about it because nobody had any reason to. Yale came twice a day, always with some excuse about supply invoices, and checked on Lyra and reported the same careful progress. Stable, then improving, then almost good. Sierra mostly stayed in the back room. On the second day, when the depot was empty in the mid-morning slow period, she came out and sat on the counter and watched Marcus work, and they talked in the fragmented, careful way of two people sharing a language neither of them had started with. She told him about her world. Not what it was called, that didn't translate through the node, but what it felt like. The particular color of the light on water, the way the air smelled after rain, the sound her mother made when she laughed, which was nothing like the controlled, precise speech the translator rendered. She held her hands out at her sides, and the silver-gray skin caught the light, and the faint bioluminescence he'd first seen under the shelf pulsed faintly along her forearms. She was alive in a way that was more than carbon and oxygen. She asked him about Earth, not in those words but in the way she gestured at him and then made an opening-out gesture that meant, "Where are you from?" He told her about the farm, about the dogs, about the particular color of a Manitoba autumn, which he described with considerable inaccuracy, but with feeling. About his daughter, briefly, carefully, in the way he allowed himself to say it in moments when it didn't hurt too badly. She listened to all of it with the full, focused attention of someone who has learned that attention is a gift worth giving. He learned on the second day that Sierra had a habit. He noticed it when the depot was quiet mid-morning and she was sitting on the counter watching him restock. Every time someone walked past the front window, the full-length one that gave a view of the main corridor, she went still. Not frightened, exactly. The fear had come down from what it had been in the hidden room, reduced by warmth and food and 3 days of nothing bad happening, but it was still there as a kind of background frequency. Every passing figure triggered a fraction of a second of assessment before she relaxed again. He started naming them for her, quietly, when the depot was empty. That one's Priya, she runs the textile stall at the end, comes by every morning for grain. She's been here longer than I have. A tall figure in work coveralls. That's one of the maintenance crew, they do the duct repairs. The one with the scar on his chin is Jevan. He's been trying to ask Priya to dinner for 2 years and has not yet succeeded. A child, roughly Sierra's apparent age, dragging what looked like an improvised toy. No idea who that is. I don't know everyone. She watched the corridor after that differently. Still assessing, but building the picture, putting faces to patterns, categorizing, the way she'd been watching the station for 2 days before she'd tried the depot. "You did this," he said at some point during the second afternoon. "Before, when you were watching the station to find someone safe." She considered the question seriously. "I watched who helped when things happened," she said, working the trade words carefully. "If someone dropped something, did anyone stop? If someone looked confused, did anyone give directions? If someone was crying," she paused. "There was a woman crying near the water dispensers on the first day. I watched who stopped." "Who stopped?" "You stopped," she said, "and a man in a red jacket, and an older woman who works near the food court." She looked at the counter. I did not pick the man in the red jacket because he stopped but then looked at his timepiece. You stopped and you did not look at your timepiece. He thought about this. He didn't remember the woman by the water dispensers, which meant he'd done it without registering it as a thing he was doing, which was probably the point. Your mother taught you that, he said, how to look for the safe people. Sierra thought about it. She taught me that everyone shows you who they are. You only have to watch long enough. A pause. She says humans are, she says there is a word, for the way humans show too much. The face shows everything. Expressive, Marcus said. Yes, Sierra looked at him with those careful amber eyes. She said it made it easier to find the ones who were telling the truth. He set down the packet he was holding. He looked at her. He thought about what it had cost, what kind of situation had to exist, for a mother to teach her child a systematic method for finding which strangers could be trusted, and then send that child out alone to use it. She was right, he said, about humans showing too much. Sierra almost smiled. She is usually right, she said. She does not like when I say this. Parents rarely do. On the third day, someone came into the shop. Marcus saw him before the door was open all the way. There was a mirror he'd positioned years ago behind the shelves that gave him a full view of the entrance, a habit from the first responder days, and what he saw was large, registered travel clearance from the flash of the node at his neck, an expression that was doing a deliberate amount of work to look casual. He was browsing the shelves, which was fine, but he was also looking at the back room door, which Marcus noticed without letting himself notice it visibly. He sold the man a grain packet. He was helpful and pleasant and dull. When the man left, Marcus sent Yale a message, "Keep away today. Stay at the clinic, don't come." Then he went to the back room and said, "I think today might be the day." Lyra, sitting up properly now, the compression device a smaller thing at her side, looked at him steadily. "You saw someone." "Browsing," Marcus said. "Wrong kind of browsing." She was quiet. Then she looked at Sierra, and some exchange passed between them without words, the way things pass between parents and children who have been through enough together. She stood up. It took her a moment. The injury still made the transition from floor to standing a careful negotiation, but she stood, and she was tall, and she was not the same person she'd been in the light-stick glow of the hidden room 3 days ago. She was someone who had been waiting for the moment they could stop waiting. "The message went out the first day," Marcus said. 3 days is the earliest." "I know," Lyra said, "but I can't wait in this room if they know the building." He looked at her. He thought about options, which were few. Then he said, "There's a freight platform, sub-level 2, not 4, registered as mine. I do the weekly shipping runs." He paused. "It's a defensible space if that means anything." She looked at him steadily for one long moment. "You were a soldier." "No, first responder, 8 months." "But you think in those terms." "Occupational bleed," he said. She almost smiled. It was the first time he'd seen that. The mask shifted enough to let it through, and it was very like Sierra's face when Sierra smiled, which she'd done twice over the last 3 days. The resemblance hit him for the first time, as a whole thing rather than a similarity. "Let's go to your freight platform," Lyra said. The sub-level 2 freight platform was where Marcus did what passed for thinking on Kelvar 9. It had a view of the exterior docking array through a reinforced window, and the docking array, at this time of night, was all moving lights against black, which was the closest thing to beautiful the station could manage. He brought them there through the back corridor, the one the delivery crews used, which bypassed the main shopping level entirely. Sierra, walking beside him, put her hand in his. He looked down at her. She was looking at the corridor ahead. He closed his fingers around hers. The freight platform was empty at this hour. Cargo drone runs happened at 400, and he had 4 hours before that. He found them a position behind the main cargo stack, where they could see the single entrance and the exterior window both. Lyra sat on a crate. Sierra sat beside her. Marcus pulled up a freight log display that he could use as both a working prop and a reasonable excuse for being here, and waited. He didn't know what he was waiting for. He found out 40 minutes later when the freight entrance opened, and 3 people walked in wearing the badges of something he didn't recognize. Not station security, not the trade authority, something else, something private. The kind of badge that got made when money wanted to look like jurisdiction. They hadn't seen the cargo stack yet. They were scanning the room. Lyra's hand closed on his arm. He looked at her. She said very quietly in her own language, not through the node, to him directly, something that was clearly a question. And then, because he hadn't understood, she switched to trade, barely above a whisper. "Can you keep them talking?" He looked at the 3 people with their private badges. He looked at the freight entrance they'd come through, and then at the exterior window, and then at the docking array beyond it, where a light that hadn't been there 40 minutes ago was growing steadily larger. "A ship. Coming in fast." "How long do you need?" he murmured. She looked at the window. She looked at the ship. 15 minutes if it is who I sent for." He stood up from behind the cargo stack. The 3 people with the private badges turned immediately. He put on the expression he used for difficult customers and bad freight inspectors, which was the same expression, patient, mild, and entirely immovable. "Can I help you?" he said. "This is a registered private freight platform. I don't recognize your badges." The one in front, a woman, taller than Marcus, with the particular stillness of someone who didn't get their way by being loud, said, "Station compliance inspection. We're looking for 2 unregistered travelers who may have accessed this platform." "Unregistered travelers need to be reported to station security," Marcus said helpfully. "The booth is on level 2. I'm happy to walk you up. We have authorization to conduct the search ourselves." "I'm sure you do," he said. "I'd love to see the authorization. Freight Platform Code 7.4 requires that I see documentation for any third-party search of registered private space." He hadn't looked up Freight Platform Code 7.4 recently, but he knew it existed because he'd had to invoke it 2 years ago during a customs dispute, and 3 people with private badges were not necessarily people who checked the code. The woman looked at him. She looked behind him. She looked at the cargo stack. "The documentation is on our vessel," she said. "I'll wait," Marcus said pleasantly. It wasn't 15 minutes. It was 9 because the ship in the docking array came in hard and fast, the kind of docking that meant whoever was flying it wasn't particularly worried about the docking bay's speed recommendations. And then the freight platform's secondary entrance, the one connected to the internal docking passage, opened, and 4 people came through it. Not cargo crews, not station security. Military, some kind of military. Marcus couldn't read the insignia, but he could read the posture, the formation, the way they moved through the room as if the room was theirs. The woman with the private badge went very still. One of the 4 newcomers said something, not in trade, in another language, the same language family as Lyra's, the same clicking consonants, and said it with the flat, absolute authority of someone who had never once in their professional life needed to raise their voice to be obeyed. The 3 people with the private badges looked at each other. The stillness went out of the woman. It was replaced by the slightly deflated quality of people who had run out of plays. They left. Not quickly, too quickly would have been a concession, but they left, and Marcus watched them go with the careful neutrality of someone who has not yet been told what he's in the middle of. Lyra walked out from behind the cargo stack. She was still managing the injury. It was still there, still requiring care. But she walked with a bearing that was entirely different from anything Marcus had seen in the back room or the hidden space below. She walked into the center of the freight platform and spoke to the 4 military figures, and they responded, and there was a brief exchange that had a formal quality, the kind of formality that means structure. One of the 4 knelt. The others followed. Marcus looked at Sierra, who was standing beside him. "Who's your mother?" he said quietly. Sierra looked up at him with those amber-glass eyes, and something that was almost a smile. "The trade said to say, Fleet Admiral," she said carefully, working the words. "But she does not like that word. She says it makes people strange." He looked back at Lyra, at the Fleet Admiral, who was speaking with her people in the language he couldn't follow, who had knelt on the floor of his back room to let him clean her wound, who had drunk his broth and trusted his supplies, and let Yale's compression device do its work for 3 days in a small locked room, who had said, "You helped us without knowing who we were." She turned and looked at him across the freight platform. Her face was back to the controlled expression, the diplomat's face, the admiral's face, but there was something at the edge of it that he recognized. She crossed the platform toward him. "Marcus Webb," she said, and the node translated it perfectly. "I owe you something that I don't know how to give." "You don't owe me anything," he said. "My daughter was safe because of you." Her voice was, for the first time since they'd gotten the node working, not entirely controlled. Something in it had edges. "That is not a debt I can dismiss." He looked at Sierra, who was looking at both of them. "She found me," Marcus said. "She did the work, I just didn't turn her away." He paused. "Make sure she knows that it was her good judgment, not my kindness." Lyra looked at him for a long moment. The controlled expression had nothing left to do now, and it let go, and what was under it was complicated and true and entirely hers. "She knows," Lyra said. "She told me." A pause. "She told me you said she had good judgment. She has not stopped telling me." He looked at Sierra, who was in that moment very interested in the ceiling. He laughed. It was the first time he'd laughed in 3 days, and it came out louder than he'd intended, and Sierra looked at him startled, and then the corner of her mouth went up. They were on the station for another 2 days, while Yale certified Lyra for travel, a certification that Lyra accepted with slightly strained patience, which told Marcus that she was someone who was not accustomed to waiting for medical clearance, which told him rather a lot. The freight platform became something other than a freight platform. Lyra's people set up a working space, and she worked, because she was apparently someone who worked through injuries and attempted detentions without significantly altering her schedule. She brought Sierra into some of it, explaining, teaching, the way you take a child to the job so they understand what the job is. Sierra translated for Marcus in the mornings when he came to check on things. He learned, piece by piece. The documents Lyra was carrying were testimony about a colony system being exploited by a commercial consortium that had bought the legal paperwork to make the exploitation look authorized. The people who'd been after them were the consortium's private security. The tribunal was a galactic council session, the kind that only convened every few years, and missing it would have meant another full cycle before the case could be heard. "She's going to testify," Marcus said to Sierra on the second morning. "She will end it," Sierra said, with absolute certainty. "The way children speak about their parents when their parents have never yet failed them in the things that counted." He didn't say that it wasn't certain. He had the impression that Lyra was the kind of person who made things certain. On the morning of the second day, Yale gave clearance, and the ship made ready. It was a different ship from the one that had come in fast to the docking array. That one had been the escort, and it had already departed. This was a military vessel, something with armor plating and a profile Marcus couldn't have named but recognized as serious. It didn't belong at a station like Kelvar 9. Nothing about the last 5 days had belonged at a station like Kelvar 9. He walked them to the docking passage. Lyra's people went ahead, giving space. Lyra stopped at the passage entrance. She said, "If you ever need anything, a posting with fewer stolen protein bars." He smiled. "I'll keep that in mind." "I mean it," she said. "In any part of the fleet's operating territory, send my name. It will open things." He nodded. He believed her. He also knew, in the way he knew most things about himself, that he was going to keep running the supply depot on Kelvar 9 for as long as the job was there to be run, because he had gotten to the point in his life where the value of a place was measured in whether it was his. "Take care of yourself," he said. "Yale's instructions are in the kit I'm sending with you. The compression device is yours." Lyra said something in her own language. The node wasn't active for this one. She'd returned Sierra's node to the station's equipment as payment without being asked, because she was that kind of person, so the words went past him without meaning. He thought he understood the shape of them anyway. Sierra was last. She stood in front of him at her full height, which was about waist level on him, and she held out both her long hands. He crouched down. She put the protein bar in his hands, the original one, the synthetic chicken one she'd stolen on the first night. She'd been carrying it the whole time. "It is yours," she said carefully in trade. The words were still new in her mouth. "I took it. I should give it back." He looked at the protein bar. He looked at her face. "Sierra," he said, "I gave that to you." She shook her head. "You gave me the good one. This one I took without asking." She pressed his fingers closed around it. "My mother says you do not take what is not given, even if you are hungry, even if you are scared." She looked at him steadily. "So I am giving it back, and then I am asking, can I have it?" He stared at her. Then he said, "Yes, it's yours." She took it back from his closed hand and clutched it with both of hers. "Thank you," she said, with great dignity. He stood. He looked at her for a moment that was just a moment, not a long one, because that was its own kind of false wait, and he said, "You were right. About me. You were right to pick me." Her amberglass eyes held his. "I know," she said. "I was watching for a long time." She turned and walked down the docking passage after her mother. He watched the passage until the door closed. He stood in the quiet of the freight platform with a synthetic chicken protein bar in his hand, and the particular feeling of someone who has been part of something briefly that they will carry. Then he went back to the supply depot, and he opened it, and he put the protein bar behind the counter where he kept the things that mattered, and he went to work. The ventilation duct wheezed. The light flickered every 43 minutes. The station smelled of fried protein blocks and recycled copper air, and the particular loneliness of being far from any planet worth naming. Marcus Webb restocked the grain shelves and watched the door, the way he always had, and felt the difference between watching for something to go wrong and watching for something to happen. 6 days of ordinary. 6 days of the supply depot opening and closing on its usual rhythm, the grain packets going out, the hydro broth selling well because the station had dropped 2 degrees in the night cooling cycle, and everyone felt it. Yale came by on the 3rd day for actual supply invoices, real ones, and didn't mention anything. And he didn't mention anything. And they had a perfectly routine conversation about the shortage on the medical compression units that needed restocking. And then she left, and he stood in the back room with its familiar smell of nothing in particular, and felt the particular quality of a space that had held something important and was now ordinary again. He restocked the shelves. He ran the numbers for the weekly freight run. He replaced the light in the display case that had been threatening to go out for 6 weeks. He was careful not to look at the spot behind the counter where the protein bar sat next to the small things he kept. The photograph of his daughter that he'd printed on actual paper before he'd left, the stone from the Manitoba property, a cable car token from a city he'd visited once and liked more than he'd expected. The protein bar looked wrong there and right there in the same moment, the way new things that matter always do. 6 days later, a message arrived on his private freight channel terminal. It wasn't a long message. It was a tribunal date, and a verdict, unanimous, and a brief line at the bottom that wasn't translated through any node because it didn't need to be. It was a drawing, the way a child draws, careful lines, deliberate, A tall alien woman and a small alien girl, and a man who was approximately shaped like a man, all three of them standing in a room that had light sticks in the corners. Under it, in trade, in a hand that was learning the letters. "We were safe because you saw us." He folded the paper and put it next to the protein bar. He went back to work.